My sister texted me a photo of my son at an airport with the caption, "By the time you read this, we'll be in a country with no extradition." The photo showed my 3-year-old son, Oliver, standing in an airport terminal holding my sister Diane's hand. He was wearing the dinosaur backpack I'd bought him last month and clutching his stuffed giraffe. The timestamp on the message was 6:47 a.m. I dropped Oliver at Diane's house the night before because I had an early morning court appearance for a case I was prosecuting. Diane had offered to watch him overnight, said it would be easier than me dragging him out of bed at 5 a.m. She'd watched Oliver dozens of times before. I trusted her completely. The second text came through while I was staring at the first photo. "You've been a terrible father since Claire died. Oliver deserves a real family. We're giving him one. Don't try to find us." I called Diane immediately. The number was disconnected. I called her husband, Graham, also disconnected. I tried their home phone. It rang and rang with no answer. I was standing in the courthouse parking lot, still in my suit, holding my phone with shaking hands, while my 3-year-old son was apparently being kidnapped by my own sister. I got in my car and drove to Diane's house, going 20 over the speed limit the whole way. The house was empty, completely empty. Not just no people, but no furniture, no dishes, no curtains, nothing. They'd moved out and I hadn't noticed. I walked through the empty rooms trying to understand what I was seeing. Diane and Graham had lived here for 5 years. When had they packed? When had they hired movers? How had they cleared out an entire house without me knowing? I'd been here 3 days ago to drop off Oliver's car seat that Diane said she needed for running errands with him. The house had been fully furnished then. I stood in the empty living room where Oliver had played with blocks on their rug just last week, where Diane had served me coffee while we talked about Oliver's preschool options. None of this made sense. I called 911 and tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher. My sister had my son and was fleeing the country. The dispatcher asked if there was a custody agreement in place. I said no. I had full custody. My wife died 2 years ago and I was Oliver's only legal parent. Diane had no claim to him whatsoever. The dispatcher said she'd send officers to the house and I should wait there. 2 police officers arrived 15 minutes later. I showed them the text messages and the photo. They walked through the empty house with me. One officer, Sergeant Michael Reeves, asked when I'd last seen the house furnished. 3 days ago. He asked if my sister had mentioned moving. Never. Did I know where she might be going? No idea. Did my sister have any reason to take Oliver? That's what I was trying to figure out. Sergeant Reeves made some calls while his partner, Officer Donna Walsh, took my statement. She asked detailed questions about my relationship with Diane, about Oliver's routine, about my wife's death. I explained that Claire had died in a car accident when Oliver was 13 months old. Diane had been incredibly supportive during that time, helping with Oliver constantly, staying at my house for weeks after the funeral to help me manage. She'd been the one who got me through the worst period of my life. This made no sense. Officer Walsh asked if there had been any recent conflicts with Diane. I said no, everything had been normal. She asked if Diane had ever expressed concerns about my parenting. I paused. Diane had made a few comments over the past months about me working too much, about Oliver spending too much time in daycare, about him needing more stability. But that was just normal sister concern, wasn't it? Walsh wrote everything down. Reeves came back and said he'd issued an Amber Alert for Oliver and put out notices to all airports and border crossings. But the text message said they were already at an airport and the photo was time-stamped over an hour ago. They could be anywhere by now. Reeves said airport security would check passenger manifests and security footage. He asked if I knew what name my sister might be traveling under. I assumed Diane Fletcher, her married name. He asked if she had any other passports or IDs. How would I know that? I didn't even know she was planning to kidnap my son. I called my parents. My mother answered on the third ring, sounding groggy. I asked if she'd heard from Diane. Mom said not since last week. Why? I told her Diane had Oliver and was fleeing the country. There was a long silence. Then my mother said that didn't sound like something Diane would do, that maybe there was a misunderstanding. I read her the text messages. Another silence. My father got on the phone and asked what I'd done to make Diane feel she needed to take Oliver. What I'd done? I'd done nothing except trust my sister to watch my son for one night. Dad said Diane wouldn't do this without reason, that I needed to think about what might have triggered this. I told him Diane had explicitly stated in her text that I was a terrible father. Dad said maybe I should listen to that instead of immediately assuming Diane was the villain. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My son had been kidnapped, and my own parents were suggesting I deserved it. I hung up and tried to focus. Reeves said I should go home in case Diane tried to contact me there. He'd call the moment they had any information. I drove home in a daze. My house felt wrong without Oliver. His toys were scattered across the living room floor. His sippy cup was still on the kitchen counter from breakfast yesterday morning. I'd kissed him goodbye, thinking I'd see him that evening. Now I had no idea where he was or if I'd ever see him again. My phone rang. Unknown number. I answered immediately. A woman's voice asked if this was Nathan Foster. I said yes. She introduced herself as Agent Victoria Sterling from the FBI. The FBI was involved already? Sterling said kidnapping across state lines was a federal crime, and if my sister was fleeing to another country, this fell under their jurisdiction. She was sending agents to my house now to conduct an interview and search for evidence. Evidence of what? Evidence that might help them locate Oliver and Diane. Within 30 minutes, 2 FBI agents were sitting in my living room. Agent Sterling was in her 40s with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything. Her partner, Agent Raymond Okoye, was younger and took notes on everything I said. Sterling asked me to walk her through the entire situation from the beginning. I explained about Claire's death, about Diane helping me through the grief, about the overnight babysitting arrangement, about finding the house empty. Sterling asked if I'd noticed Diane acting strangely recently. I thought back over the past weeks. Diane had been asking a lot of questions about my work schedule, about Oliver's daycare, about my finances. At the time, I'd thought she was just being interested and supportive. Now I wondered if she'd been gathering information. Agent Okoye asked about Graham, Diane's husband. I didn't know Graham well, honestly. He was quiet, worked in IT, seemed nice enough. They'd been married for 8 years, no kids of their own, which I'd always assumed was by choice. Sterling asked if Graham had any international connections or dual citizenship. Not that I knew of. She made a note. Sterling then asked about my wife, Claire's death. What did that have to do with anything? She said she needed to understand all the family dynamics. Claire had died in a single-car accident on a rainy night coming home from a work conference. The police investigation concluded she'd hydroplaned and hit a tree. It was ruled accidental. Sterling asked if Diane had been close to Claire. Very close. They'd been best friends before Claire and I even started dating. Actually, Diane had introduced us. Sterling made another note and exchanged a look with Okoye that I couldn't read. What was that look about? Sterling said they needed to examine Oliver's room and go through any documents related to Diane. I took them upstairs. Oliver's room was exactly as he'd left it. His bed was unmade because he'd been excited about staying at Aunt Diane's house and rushed out without tidying up. His closet was full of clothes. But when I opened his dresser drawers, I realized several items were missing. His favorite pajamas, his special blanket, 3 or 4 outfits I knew he loved. Diane had taken them. That meant this was planned. She hadn't just impulsively grabbed Oliver this morning. She'd been slowly taking his belongings over time, preparing. How long had she been planning this? Agent Sterling photographed the room and the missing items I could identify. Okoye went through my home office, examining documents and my computer. Sterling asked if Diane had keys to my house. Yes, she'd had them for emergencies since Claire died. Sterling suggested we check if anything else was missing. We went through the house systematically. I discovered that the box of Claire's jewelry I'd been keeping for Oliver when he was older was gone. Photo albums from when Claire and I were dating and first married were missing. Claire's college yearbooks were gone. Personal items that had no monetary value, but significant sentimental value. Why would Diane take those? Sterling said it suggested Diane was trying to take pieces of Claire with her, that this might be about more than just Oliver. What did that mean? Sterling said they'd need to investigate Claire's relationship with Diane more thoroughly. I asked what she was implying. Sterling said she wasn't implying anything yet, but kidnapping cases involving family members often had complex motivations that weren't immediately obvious. She needed to understand all the relationships involved. My phone buzzed. A text from another unknown number. Stop looking for us. Oliver is safe and happy. He'll have the life Claire wanted for him. The life you couldn't give him. I showed it to Sterling. She immediately had Okoye start a trace on the number. I asked what the message meant about the life Claire wanted. Sterling asked if Claire had ever expressed concerns about my parenting or our lifestyle. No, never. We'd been happy. We'd been planning to have another child before she died. Sterling made another note in her file. Okoye came back and said the text came from a burner phone, currently off. Last ping from a cell tower near the international terminal at the airport. So they were definitely flying internationally. Sterling made calls to airport security and immigration. Within an hour, they had information. Diane Fletcher and Graham Fletcher had boarded a flight to Mexico City that morning at 8:15 a.m. They'd used their real passports. There was no record of a child traveling with them. But Oliver was in the photo at the airport. So where was he? Sterling said they must have used false documents for Oliver. Creating a fake passport for a 3-year-old would require photos, paperwork, connections. This wasn't something Diane threw together in a few days. She'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. Sterling asked if I had Oliver's passport. I went to my safe where I kept important documents. Oliver's passport was missing. Also missing were his birth certificate, his social security card, and his medical records. Diane had access to my safe because I'd given her the combination after Claire died, in case something happened to me and she needed to get important documents for Oliver. She'd used that trust to steal everything she'd need to take him out of the country. Sterling photographed the empty safe. She said this level of planning suggested Diane had help, probably from Graham given his IT background. False documents, researching countries without extradition agreements, coordinating the move. It required skills and resources. Okoye discovered something on my computer. My email had been accessed from an IP address traced to Diane's house 6 weeks ago. She'd been reading my emails, monitoring my communications. Sterling asked what she might have seen. My work emails mostly. I was a prosecutor, so nothing particularly personal. But then I remembered, 6 weeks ago, I'd been emailing with a family lawyer, about updating my will to name a guardian for Oliver if something happened to me. I'd been considering asking my cousin David since he had 3 kids and lived nearby. I'd mentioned in one email that I wasn't sure Diane would be the right choice as guardian because she and Graham had no parenting experience. Had Diane read that? Did she think I was planning to cut her out of Oliver's life? Agent Sterling said that could be a trigger, that Diane might have interpreted my guardian considerations as evidence I was planning to separate her from Oliver. But that's not what I meant at all. I just wanted someone with parenting experience to raise Oliver if I died. Sterling said Diane might not have seen it that way, especially if she was already emotionally fragile about not having children of her own. Okoye found more evidence of surveillance. My cloud storage had been accessed from the same IP address. Diane had been looking at my photos, my documents, everything. She'd been monitoring my life while pretending everything was normal. Sterling's phone rang. She stepped into the other room to take the call. When she came back, her expression was grim. Mexican immigration had confirmed that Diane and Graham Fletcher entered Mexico City, but there was still no record of a child with them. However, security footage from the Mexico City airport showed them leaving the terminal with a small child matching Oliver's description. The child was listed on their documentation as their son, Samuel Fletcher, age 3, American citizen. They'd given Oliver a completely false identity. Sterling said once they entered Mexico, they could go anywhere. Mexico had connections to Central and South America, to Caribbean islands, dozens of places where extradition was complicated or impossible. We might never find them. I couldn't breathe. My 3-year-old son was in a foreign country with a fake identity, with people who'd planned his kidnapping for months, and I had no way to get him back. Sterling put a hand on my shoulder and said they weren't giving up. FBI had contacts with international agencies. They'd track Diane and Graham's movements. They'd find Oliver, but her eyes said what her mouth didn't. This was going to be extremely difficult. Okoye asked about my sister's finances. Did she have money to support living abroad indefinitely? I had no idea. I didn't know anything about Diane's financial situation. Sterling said they'd subpoena bank records, credit cards, any financial trail that might show where she was getting resources for this. I remembered something. About 3 months ago, Diane mentioned she'd sold some investment property her late grandmother had left her. She'd said something about finally cashing out and securing her future. At the time, I'd been happy for her. Now I wondered if that money was funding Oliver's kidnapping. Sterling made a note to investigate property sales. My phone rang again. My mother. I didn't want to answer, but Sterling nodded that I should. Mom was crying. She said she'd just spoken to Diane, who'd called to say goodbye. Goodbye? Mom said Diane told her she was taking Oliver somewhere safe, somewhere he could have a real childhood, that she was sorry, but she had to do this. Mom asked where they'd gone, and Diane wouldn't say, just that it was somewhere I couldn't reach them. I asked Mom if Diane said anything else. Mom hesitated, then said, Diane claimed she was doing what Claire would have wanted, that before Claire died, Claire had asked Diane to take care of Oliver if anything happened, to take care of him, not kidnap him. Mom said Diane's exact words were, Claire asked me to be Oliver's mother. That couldn't be true. Claire never said anything like that to me. We'd discussed guardianship after Oliver was born and agreed we'd revisit it later, but Claire never suggested Diane should raise him. Sterling was listening to my side of the conversation and making notes. When I hung up, she asked if Claire and Diane had been alone together before Claire died. I thought back. Claire's accident happened at night. She'd been driving home from a conference in the city, about 2 hours away, but the day before the conference, Claire had lunch with Diane. I remembered because Claire came home and seemed quiet, almost sad. I'd asked if everything was okay, and she'd said she'd just had an emotional conversation with Diane about motherhood and the future. I'd assumed they'd been talking about Diane's struggles with infertility. Now I wondered what they'd actually discussed. Sterling asked if I knew what Claire and Diane talked about that day. No, Claire hadn't given me details. She'd just said Diane was having a hard time and needed support. Sterling exchanged another look with Okoye. What were they thinking? What weren't they telling me? Agent Okoye pulled up something on his laptop and turned it toward me. It was a social media post from Diane's account, posted 2 years ago, right after Claire's funeral. The post was a photo of Diane holding baby Oliver, with a caption that read, I promise I'll take care of him the way you wanted. Always. At the time, I'd thought it was a touching tribute to Claire. Now, it looked like a declaration of intent. Sterling asked if I'd seen this post before. Yes. I'd even commented on it, thanking Diane for her support. Sterling scrolled through more of Diane's social media. There were dozens of posts over the past 2 years featuring Oliver. Photos of Diane and Oliver at the park, at the zoo, at her house. The captions used phrases like, my sweet boy, mommy's little helper, our special days together. I'd seen these posts and thought Diane was just being a devoted aunt, but looking at them now, they read like a mother posting about her son. Sterling said this suggested Diane had been building a narrative online, creating evidence that she was Oliver's primary caregiver, possibly to justify taking him. The comments on her posts reinforced this. People who didn't know our family wrote things like, what a beautiful mom and son, and you're such a great mother. Diane never corrected them. She let people believe Oliver was hers. My phone buzzed again. Another text from the unknown number. Check your email. We need to talk about Oliver's future. I opened my email and found a message from an address I didn't recognize. The email was long, written by Diane, explaining her reasons for taking Oliver. She wrote that after Claire died, she'd realized Oliver needed a mother figure, that I was so consumed by grief and work that I was neglecting him, that Claire had specifically asked her to step in if I couldn't handle single parenthood. She wrote that, over the past 2 years, she'd essentially been raising Oliver while I focused on my career, that he called her mama sometimes when we were alone, that he was happier and more secure with her than with me. She wrote that she'd consulted with lawyers who told her she'd never get custody legally because family courts favored biological parents, even when they were inadequate, so she had no choice but to take Oliver somewhere we could build a real life together. She wrote that Graham had gotten a job offer in Ecuador, a country with no extradition treaty with the United States, that they'd be settled there soon, and Oliver would have a wonderful childhood. She ended by saying she hoped someday I'd understand and forgive her, but if not, at least Oliver would be safe and loved. I finished reading and felt sick. Diane genuinely believed she was rescuing Oliver from me. Agent Sterling read the email over my shoulder. She said this was actually helpful because it established Diane's location and some of her plans. Ecuador. Sterling made calls immediately, contacting FBI legal attachés in South America. Okoye said Ecuador had no extradition treaty with the U.S., which meant even if we located Oliver, we couldn't force Ecuador to send him back. We'd have to work through Ecuadorian courts. And family law in Ecuador favored whoever had physical custody of the child. If Diane had Oliver there, she effectively had him permanently, unless we could prove to an Ecuadorian judge that she'd kidnapped him. But that would require Ecuadorian authorities caring enough to investigate, which was unlikely. Sterling said we had a small window before Diane and Graham reached Ecuador from Mexico. If we could intercept them during their travel, we might be able to recover Oliver. But once they were settled in Ecuador, this became infinitely more complicated. My phone rang. It was my boss, District Attorney Patricia Wright. She'd heard about Oliver through police channels and wanted to know what she could do to help. I explained the situation. Patricia said she'd contact the State Department and request intervention, that as a prosecutor I had connections and resources most parents wouldn't have in this situation. She'd make sure everyone who could help was notified immediately. Within hours, I had a call from State Department officials. They explained that, while they couldn't force Ecuador to return Oliver, they could put pressure through diplomatic channels. They could make Diane and Graham's lives difficult in Ecuador, flag their passports, work with Ecuadorian immigration. But it would take time, and there were no guarantees. They asked if I had any evidence that Oliver was in danger with Diane. Physical danger? No, Diane would never hurt him physically. She loved him. But she'd kidnapped him, traumatized him by taking him from his father, was holding him in a foreign country against his will. Did that count as danger? The State Department official said Ecuadorian authorities would view this as a custody dispute between a father and an aunt, not a clear-cut kidnapping case. Many countries didn't have the same strict laws about parental rights that the U.S. had. If Diane could convince Ecuadorian officials that she was protecting Oliver from an unfit father, they might let her stay. Agent Sterling came back with new information. They'd traced Graham's email and found correspondence with an immigration attorney in Quito, Ecuador. The attorney specialized in helping foreigners relocate and establish residency. Graham had been planning this for at least 6 months. They'd researched neighborhoods, schools, employment opportunities. The level of premeditation was staggering. Okoye discovered something else. Diane had created a blog 6 months ago under a pseudonym documenting her concerns about my parenting. The blog posts described me as emotionally absent, working excessive hours, leaving Oliver in daycare from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day, having no patience when he cried or misbehaved. Some of the descriptions were based on truth, but twisted to sound worse. Yes, I worked long hours, but I was a single parent, building a career to support my son. Yes, Oliver was in daycare, but it was a good facility where he had friends and activities. Yes, I sometimes lost patience, but what parent didn't? Diane had taken normal single-parent struggles and documented them as evidence of neglect. Sterling said this blog would be a problem if we went to court in Ecuador. Diane had been building a case against me for months, creating a paper trail that made her look like a concerned family member rescuing a child from a bad situation. Several blog posts referenced conversations Diane claimed to have had with Claire before Claire died. According to the blog, Claire had expressed concerns about whether I could handle single parenthood, had asked Diane to watch over Oliver, had made Diane promise to step in if I was failing. Were these conversations real? I had no way to know. Claire was dead and couldn't confirm or deny anything Diane claimed. Sterling asked if Claire had kept a journal or written letters, not that I knew of, but I hadn't gone through all of Claire's belongings after she died. Some boxes were still in the attic, things I couldn't face sorting through. Agent Sterling suggested we go through Claire's belongings to see if there was anything that might contradict Diane's narrative. We went up to the attic, and I pulled down 3 boxes labeled with Claire's name. Inside were clothes, books, work documents, personal items. At the bottom of the second box, I found Claire's journal. I'd never read it before. It felt like an invasion of privacy even after her death. But now I needed to know what Clare had really said about Diane and Oliver. Sterling and Okoye stepped back to give me space as I opened the journal. Claire's handwriting filled page after page. Most entries were mundane, notes about work, about Oliver's development, about missing adult conversations. Then I found an entry from about a month before Claire died. She wrote about having lunch with Diane and feeling uncomfortable with how Diane was acting around Oliver. Claire wrote that Diane had been holding Oliver and refusing to give him back when he reached for Claire, that Diane had said something about how Oliver needed her more than he needed his own mother, because she could be home with him full-time while Claire worked. Claire wrote that she was worried Diane was becoming too attached, that she needed to set some boundaries but didn't want to hurt Diane's feelings since Diane couldn't have children of her own. Claire wrote, "I love my sister, but I'm concerned about her fixation on Oliver. I need to talk to Nathan about limiting her alone time with him." I stopped reading and looked at Sterling. Claire had been worried about Diane's attachment to Oliver before she died. She'd never mentioned this to me. Why hadn't she told me? I kept reading. The next entry, dated a week before Claire's death, described another conversation with Diane. Claire wrote that she'd tried to gently suggest Diane should consider therapy to work through her feelings about infertility, and Diane had become angry. Diane had said she didn't need therapy, she needed a child, and Oliver was practically hers already since she spent so much time with him. Claire wrote that she'd told Diane that Oliver was her son, not Diane's, and that Diane needed to respect boundaries. Diane had apparently said that Claire was being selfish, that Claire had everything including a career and a child while Diane had nothing, that if Claire really loved her sister, she'd share. Claire wrote, "I'm genuinely frightened by how Diane is talking. It's not rational. I told Nathan I need to talk to him seriously about Diane's access to Oliver, but the conversation will have to wait until after my conference this week." Claire died 2 days later, before they could have that conversation. The final entry in the journal was dated the day before Claire died. Claire wrote that Diane had called her, apologizing for her behavior, asking to meet for breakfast before Claire left for her conference. Claire had agreed, wanting to smooth things over. That breakfast meeting was the last time anyone saw Claire before her accident that night. Agent Sterling asked if she could read the journal entries. I handed it over, feeling numb. Sterling read carefully, then showed specific passages to Okoye. They were both silent for a long moment. Finally, Sterling said they needed to investigate Claire's accident more thoroughly. What was she suggesting? Sterling said maybe Claire's death wasn't an accident. I stared at her. Claire died in a single-car crash on a rainy night. The police investigated. There was no evidence of foul play. Sterling said the police investigated it as a traffic accident, not as a potential crime. They wouldn't have been looking for evidence of sabotage. Given what they now knew about Diane's obsession with Oliver and her planning capabilities, given Claire's journal entries about wanting to separate Diane from Oliver, given that Claire died right before she was going to discuss concerns with me, Sterling thought they should take another look. Okoye said he'd contact the police department that handled Claire's accident and request they reopen the case. I couldn't process what they were suggesting. My sister murdered my wife to steal my son? That couldn't be possible. Diane loved Claire. They'd been best friends for over 20 years. Sterling gently pointed out that people who committed crimes against family members often had close relationships with their victims first. Betrayal required proximity and trust. Diane had both. My phone rang. Unknown number again. I answered. Diane's voice came through, tight with emotion. She said she'd heard the FBI was involved and wanted to explain herself before I believed their narrative. I put the phone on speaker so Sterling and Okoye could hear. Diane said she knew I was angry, but she'd done this out of love. That Oliver needed a stable home with 2 parents and a mother who could focus on him full-time instead of working 60-hour weeks. I asked about Claire's journal entries, about Claire's concerns about Diane's attachment to Oliver. Diane was silent for several seconds. Then she said Claire had been stressed and emotional during that time, that she'd misunderstood Diane's intentions, that the journal entries weren't accurate. I asked about the breakfast meeting the day before Claire died. What had they discussed? Diane said they'd talked about Claire's work stress and about how Diane could help more with Oliver. That was all. Nothing dramatic. I asked directly, "Did you have anything to do with Claire's accident?" Diane's voice went cold. She said she couldn't believe I'd ask her that Claire was her best friend and she'd been devastated by her death. She said if I was going to accuse her of murder, this conversation was over. She hung up. Sterling immediately tried to trace the call, but the number was already off. Agent Okoye got a call from the police department that had investigated Claire's accident. They'd pulled the case file and agreed to review it with fresh eyes given new information. The detective who'd handled the case originally, Robert Nash, remembered it clearly. Single vehicle accident, rainy conditions, driver lost control and hit a tree. Claire had died on impact. Her car had been totaled, but the investigation found no mechanical issues, no evidence of tampering, no suspicious circumstances. The case was closed as an accidental death. Okoye asked if they'd investigated whether anyone else had been in the car or nearby. Nash said there was no evidence of another person, but he admitted they hadn't been looking for that, since there was no reason to suspect foul play. Okoye asked if the car still existed. Nash said it had been salvaged and likely scrapped by now, but he'd check with the salvage yard. Sterling asked me detailed questions about Claire's car. What kind was it? A silver Nissan Altima. Did she have any mechanical problems before the accident? No. The car had been serviced a month earlier and was running fine. Did anyone else drive the car? Just me occasionally, and Diane had borrowed it once or twice when her car was in the shop. When was the last time Diane borrowed Claire's car? I thought back. About 2 weeks before the accident, Diane's car had needed repairs and she'd borrowed Claire's car for 3 days. Sterling asked if I knew where Diane had taken the car during those days. To work and back, presumably. Did Diane have mechanical knowledge? Her husband Graham did. He was into cars and often worked on their vehicles himself. Sterling and Okoye exchanged another one of those looks. Sterling said they needed to consider the possibility that the accident had been staged. If someone had tampered with Claire's car in a way that would cause an accident under the right conditions, rainy night, dark road, the driver might lose control and it would look accidental. Modern cars had computer systems that could be hacked, braking systems that could be compromised, steering mechanisms that could be sabotaged. If Graham had access to Claire's car for 3 days and had the technical knowledge, he could have done something that wouldn't be obvious in a standard accident investigation. But this was speculation. They needed evidence. Nash called back. The salvage yard still had what was left of Claire's car. It had been sitting in their lot for 2 years because the insurance payout had been complicated and no one had claimed the salvage value. The car was pretty destroyed, but some parts were intact. Nash was sending a forensic team to examine it, specifically looking at the computer system, brakes, and steering. Sterling said this would take time, but if there was evidence of tampering, they'd find it. Meanwhile, we still had no idea exactly where in Ecuador Diane and Graham had taken Oliver. Agent Sterling contacted Interpol and requested assistance locating them. Interpol issued a yellow notice for Oliver, alerting member countries that he was a missing child. But Ecuador wasn't always cooperative with Interpol requests, especially in custody disputes. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about Oliver, wondering if he was scared, if he was asking for me, if Diane was telling him lies about why I wasn't there. He was 3 years old. He couldn't understand what was happening. To him, this was probably an adventure with Aunt Diane, but eventually, he'd realize something was wrong. He'd realize I was missing. What would Diane tell him? Would she say I didn't want him anymore? Would she try to erase me from his memory the way she was trying to erase me from his life? The next morning, Agent Okoye called with news. They'd found the travel records. After Mexico City, Diane and Graham had flown to Panama City, then taken a small regional flight to Quito, Ecuador. They'd checked into a hotel in Quito's historic district 2 days ago under their real names. Okoye had contacted Ecuadorian authorities and requested they locate and detain Diane and Graham for questioning regarding Oliver's kidnapping. But the Ecuadorian police said this was a civil custody matter, not a criminal matter, and they didn't intervene in family disputes unless there was evidence of child abuse. Without proof that Oliver was in danger, they wouldn't remove him from Diane's custody. Sterling said this was expected, but frustrating. Our best option was to work through Ecuadorian family courts, but that meant I'd have to travel to Ecuador, hire local attorneys, file custody petitions, and hope an Ecuadorian judge would side with me over Diane. The process could take months or years. I told my boss, Patricia, that I needed to go to Ecuador immediately. She said she'd arrange leave and connect me with attorneys who specialized in international custody cases. Within 24 hours, I was on a flight to Quito with Agent Okoye, who'd volunteered to accompany me to provide FBI support. Sterling stayed in the U.S. to continue investigating Claire's death and building a criminal case against Diane. The flight was miserable. I couldn't stop imagining what Oliver was going through. Couldn't stop blaming myself for trusting Diane, for not seeing the signs. Claire had seen them. Claire had known something was wrong with Diane's attachment to Oliver. If I'd read Claire's journal sooner, if Claire had told me her concerns before she died, maybe none of this would have happened. When we landed in Quito, we were met by a local attorney named Isabella Vargas, who specialized in international family law. Isabella had been briefed on the situation and had already filed emergency custody petitions with the Ecuadorian family court. She warned me that the process would be slow and complicated. Ecuadorian courts operated on their own timeline, and they were generally sympathetic to whoever had physical custody of the child. Diane's claim that she was protecting Oliver from an inadequate father would be taken seriously. I'd have to prove not only that I was a fit parent, but that Diane had no legal right to Oliver. Isabella said she'd also filed a request with immigration to prevent Diane and Graham from leaving Ecuador while the custody case was pending. If approved, their passports would be flagged, and they'd be detained if they tried to fly out. We went to the hotel where Diane and Graham had checked in. They were no longer there. The desk clerk said they'd checked out that morning. No forwarding address. They'd known we were coming. Someone must have tipped them off, or maybe Diane was monitoring my movements somehow. Okoye made calls to local police and immigration. Within hours, we had information. Diane and Graham had rented an apartment in Cuenca, a city about 5 hours south of Quito. Cuenca was popular with American expats, had a large English-speaking community, good schools. It made sense as a place to disappear. We drove to Cuenca that night. The city was beautiful, colonial architecture and mountain views, but I barely noticed. We found the apartment building where Diane had rented a unit. The building manager confirmed that a couple with a young child had moved in 2 days ago, but said privacy laws prevented him from giving us more information. Okoye showed his FBI credentials, explained this was a kidnapping case. The manager hesitated, then said the couple was in apartment 304. We went up to the 3rd floor. I stood outside apartment 304 trying to calm my breathing. My son was behind that door. I knocked. Graham answered. He looked shocked to see me, then tried to close the door. Okoye put his foot in the doorway. Graham said we had no right to be there, that this was harassment. I pushed past him into the apartment. Oliver was sitting on the living room floor playing with toy trucks. He looked up when I came in and his face lit up. He yelled, "Daddy!" and ran to me. I picked him up and held him so tight. He was real. He was safe. He was in my arms. Oliver hugged my neck and asked where I'd been, said he'd missed me. Diane appeared from the bedroom. She looked furious. She demanded I put Oliver down, that I had no right to burst into their home. Her home? This was a rented apartment in a foreign country where she'd taken my kidnapped son. Diane said I was trespassing and she'd call the police. Okoye said please do, that he'd be happy to explain to Ecuadorian police how she'd kidnapped Oliver and fled international borders. Diane's face went pale. She said she hadn't kidnapped anyone, that she was protecting Oliver from a neglectful father, that she had just as much right to him as I did. She'd been his primary caregiver for 2 years. She'd been the one raising him while I worked constantly. She was the mother figure in his life. I told Diane that Claire knew what she was doing, that Claire had been concerned about Diane's obsession with Oliver, that Claire had wanted to limit Diane's access. I mentioned Claire's journal entries. Diane's expression changed. She asked how I'd gotten Claire's journal. From the attic, where Claire kept it. Diane said that journal wasn't accurate, that Claire had been going through a difficult time and had written things that weren't true. I asked again about Claire's accident. Diane's face went hard. She said she wasn't discussing that I was delusional if I thought she'd hurt Claire. Graham moved between us and Diane. He said we needed to leave, that they'd settle this through proper legal channels. Okoye said they were right. This would be settled through courts, but in the meantime, Oliver was coming with us. Graham said Oliver wasn't going anywhere. Legally, we couldn't force them to hand over Oliver without an Ecuadorian court order, but I wasn't leaving without my son. Oliver was still in my arms, starting to sense the tension. He asked why everyone was yelling. I told him everything was okay, that Daddy was here now. Diane said I was confusing him, that he'd been settling in nicely until I showed up. She told Oliver that Daddy had to leave soon, but they'd see each other again later. Oliver's grip on my neck tightened. He said he wanted to stay with Daddy. Diane's face crumpled. She'd been expecting Oliver to choose her, to prefer staying with her, but Oliver knew who his father was. Despite 2 years of Diane trying to position herself as his primary caregiver, despite whatever she'd told him during the kidnapping, Oliver wanted his father. I told Graham and Diane that I was taking Oliver to my hotel. They could call the police if they wanted, but I wasn't leaving him here. Graham looked at Diane. She was crying now, saying this wasn't fair, that she'd done everything for Oliver, that she deserved to be his mother. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered that she'd stolen my son and fled the country, that she might have murdered my wife. Okoye negotiated. He said we'd take Oliver to our hotel for tonight, and tomorrow we'd all appear before an Ecuadorian family court judge to determine temporary custody. If Diane and Graham agreed to this, we wouldn't file additional criminal charges for the moment. If they refused, Okoye would have Ecuadorian police detain them for international kidnapping. Graham agreed. Diane started to protest, but Graham cut her off. He knew they were cornered. We left with Oliver. In the car, Oliver asked why Aunt Diane was sad. I said Aunt Diane made some bad choices and was upset about it. Oliver asked if we were going home. I said soon, but first we had to talk to some people in Ecuador. Oliver seemed satisfied with that answer and fell asleep in my arms in the hotel room. I held him all night, terrified that if I let go, he'd disappear again. The next morning, we appeared before Judge Valentina Morales in Cuenca's family court. Isabella presented our case. Oliver was my biological son. I had full legal custody in the United States. Diane had no legal claim to him. She'd kidnapped him and fled internationally. Diane's attorney, a local lawyer named Carlos Mendez, argued that this was a custody dispute, not a kidnapping, that Diane had been Oliver's primary caregiver for 2 years, that she'd acted in Oliver's best interest by removing him from an inadequate home situation. Judge Morales asked Diane directly why she'd taken Oliver without my permission. Diane said because she knew I'd never willingly give him up, even though he was better off with her. Judge Morales asked what evidence Diane had that I was an inadequate parent. Diane presented her blog, her documentation of my long work hours, Oliver's extended time in daycare. She presented character statements from people in the US who'd observed my parenting, though I noticed these were all friends of Diane's who barely knew me. She presented her own testimony about being Oliver's de facto mother for 2 years. Judge Morales then turned to me. She asked what evidence I had of being a fit parent. Isabella presented my financial stability, my career as a prosecutor, character references from colleagues and friends, Oliver's pediatrician stating he was healthy and well cared for. I testified about my relationship with Oliver, about our daily routines, about how involved I was despite working full-time. I explained that Diane had helped with childcare because I trusted her, not because I was neglecting Oliver. Judge Morales asked Oliver, very gently, where he wanted to live. Oliver said, "With Daddy." Diane made a sound like a wounded animal. Judge Morales said she'd review all evidence and issue a temporary custody ruling within 24 hours. In the meantime, Oliver would stay with me at the hotel, supervised by Ecuadorian social services. Diane and Graham were required to remain in Cuenca and surrender their passports. We left the courtroom. Oliver held my hand tightly. Diane tried to approach us, but her attorney stopped her. She called out to Oliver, saying she loved him. Oliver waved at her but didn't let go of my hand. That night in the hotel, I called Agent Sterling for an update on Clare's accident investigation. Sterling said the forensic team had examined what remained of Clare's car. They'd found evidence that the car's computer system had been tampered with approximately 2 weeks before the accident, consistent with the timing of when Diane had borrowed the car. Someone with technical knowledge had altered the programming in a way that would cause the brakes to fail under specific conditions. High speed, wet roads, sharp turns. The tampering was sophisticated and wouldn't have been caught in a routine inspection. The brakes would work normally under regular driving conditions, but would fail catastrophically when stressed. On a rainy night, on a winding road, Clare wouldn't have been able to stop or control the car. The crash was made to look like an accident, but it was murder. Sterling said they were building a case against Graham Fletcher for vehicle tampering and murder, and against Diane Fletcher for conspiracy to commit murder and kidnapping. They'd issued arrest warrants but couldn't execute them while Diane and Graham were in Ecuador. Sterling was working with the State Department to request extradition. I felt sick. My sister had orchestrated my wife's murder so she could take my son, the woman I'd trusted completely, who'd held me while I cried at Clare's funeral, who'd helped me through the darkest period of my life, had caused that darkness in the first place. Everything had been calculated. The support, the child care, positioning herself as Oliver's second mother. It was all part of a plan that began when she murdered Clare. The next day, Judge Morales issued her ruling. Oliver would remain in my custody. Diane and Graham were denied custody rights in Ecuador and were ordered to return Oliver to the United States immediately. The judge said that while she understood complex family dynamics, removing a child from his legal parent and fleeing internationally was not acceptable. Diane's claims about my parenting weren't substantiated enough to justify her actions. Oliver's clear preference for me was also a significant factor. Diane sobbed when the ruling was read. Her attorney tried to argue, but Judge Morales was done. She said if Diane felt I was an unfit parent, she should have pursued legal remedies in the United States, not taken the law into her own hands. We had 24 hours to leave Ecuador with Oliver. At the hotel, Agent Okoye informed Diane and Graham that they were wanted for murder in the United States. He served them with copies of the arrest warrants. Graham's face went white. Diane looked almost relieved, like she'd been waiting for this moment. She said she'd known I wouldn't stop until I destroyed her. I said she'd destroyed herself by murdering my wife and kidnapping my son. Diane insisted she didn't murder anyone, that Graham had acted alone, that she hadn't known what he'd done until after Clare was already dead. Graham started to protest, but his attorney stopped him. Okoye said they could sort out who did what when they were extradited. Diane and Graham had a choice. They could fight extradition and stay in Ecuador, but they'd be detained while the process played out and would likely lose eventually. Or they could voluntarily return to the U.S. and face charges there. Either way, they were going to prison. Graham chose to fight extradition. He'd be held in Ecuadorian custody while his case was processed. Diane surprised everyone by agreeing to voluntary return. She said she wanted to go home, that she was tired of running. I think she knew it was over. She'd lost Oliver. She was facing murder charges, and there was nowhere left to hide. On the flight back to the United States, Oliver sat between me and Agent Okoye. Diane was several rows back in custody. Oliver asked why Aunt Diane was with the police officers. I said Aunt Diane had made very bad choices and had to talk to the police about it. Oliver asked if he'd see Aunt Diane again. I said maybe someday when he was older, if he wanted to. Oliver thought about this, then said he just wanted to go home. Me too, buddy. Me too. We landed at Miami International Airport where federal agents took custody of Diane. She looked at Oliver one last time before they led her away. Her expression was heartbroken but also strangely peaceful, like she'd finally accepted that this fantasy she'd been living was over. Oliver waved goodbye to her. He was too young to understand the full magnitude of what had happened. Someday, I'd have to explain that Aunt Diane had killed his mother and tried to steal him away. But not today. Today, we were just going home. The trial took place 8 months later. Diane pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and international flight to avoid prosecution. In exchange for her cooperation against Graham, she received a sentence of 25 years. She'd be eligible for parole in 15. Graham fought the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. The forensic analysis of Clare's car, his technical knowledge, his financial records showing he'd researched how to tamper with automotive computer systems. He was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping. He received life without parole. At Diane's sentencing, she made a statement. She said she'd never meant to hurt anyone, that she'd just wanted to be a mother, that her love for Oliver had made her lose sight of right and wrong. She said she knew she couldn't undo what she'd done, but she hoped someday Oliver would understand that everything she did came from love, even if it was twisted and wrong. The judge said love didn't justify murder and kidnapping, that Diane had destroyed multiple lives, including her own, in pursuit of something that was never hers to take. Diane was led away to begin her sentence. I never visited her in prison. Some of her friends and my parents thought I was being cruel, that I should let her see Oliver occasionally since she'd been such a big part of his early life. But I couldn't. Every time I looked at Diane, I saw the person who'd murdered my wife. Oliver was 4.5 now. He was in preschool and thriving. He rarely mentioned Aunt Diane anymore. When he did, it was usually to ask simple questions about why she'd gone away. I told him age-appropriate versions of the truth. Aunt Diane had loved him very much, but had made bad choices that hurt people, so she had to go away for a long time. Oliver seemed to accept this. We'd started therapy, both individual sessions for Oliver and joint sessions for us to work through the trauma of the kidnapping. The therapist, Dr. Lauren Kimball, said Oliver was remarkably resilient. Children often were. The kidnapping would have lasting effects, she warned, possibly trust issues or anxiety about separation. But with consistent support and reassurance, Oliver would be okay. I'd also been in therapy processing everything. The betrayal by my sister, the revelation that Claire's death wasn't an accident, the guilt that I hadn't protected Oliver better. Dr. Kimball reminded me that I couldn't have known what Diane was planning, that she'd been manipulating everyone for years, that I wasn't responsible for her actions. Intellectually, I understood that. Emotionally, it was harder to accept. We'd sold the house where Oliver and I had lived with Claire. Too many memories, too much pain. We moved to a different neighborhood, started fresh. I'd reduced my hours at the DA's office, taking a position with less trial work so I could spend more time with Oliver. Patricia had been understanding, telling me family came first. Oliver had play dates with kids from his preschool, had birthday parties, had a normal childhood. Sometimes I'd watch him playing and feel overwhelming gratitude that we'd gotten him back, that Diane hadn't succeeded in taking him away forever. Other times I'd feel overwhelming rage at Diane for putting us through this, for killing Claire, for trying to steal our son. The emotions were complicated and contradictory. Dr. Kimball said that was normal, that healing wasn't linear. My parents had struggled with the truth about Diane. They'd wanted to believe she was a victim too, that Graham had manipulated her, that she genuinely thought she was helping Oliver. But the evidence showed Diane had been planning to take Oliver for months before Claire's death, that she'd been the driving force behind everything. Mom had cried for weeks after the trial, grieving the daughter she thought she knew. Dad had stopped talking to me for a while, angry that I'd pressed charges against Diane. But eventually they came around, accepting that Diane's actions had consequences. They asked if they could see Oliver. I allowed supervised visits at first, then gradually unsupervised as I became confident they wouldn't try to contact Diane on his behalf or undermine my parenting. Oliver loved his grandparents, and they loved him. That relationship was worth preserving even if things were strained between me and them. Agent Sterling had stayed in touch, checking on us periodically. She said this case had haunted her, the way Diane had manipulated everyone, the way she'd murdered her best friend and still convinced herself she was doing the right thing. Sterling said she'd seen a lot of horrible crimes in her career, but this one stood out because of how calculated it was, how long Diane had planned it, how many lives she'd destroyed while believing she was acting out of love. I asked Sterling if she thought Diane had truly loved Oliver or if it was just obsession. Sterling said probably both, that love and obsession weren't always distinct, that Diane's inability to have her own child had twisted her love for Oliver into something possessive and ultimately destructive. 5 years after the kidnapping, Oliver was 8 years old. We'd settled into a good rhythm. He was in 3rd grade, played soccer, loved science and art. He had friends and sleepovers and a childhood that looked normal from the outside. He rarely mentioned Diane anymore. When he did, it was factually, like mentioning a historical figure rather than someone who'd been central to his early life. He knew the basic facts. Aunt Diane had taken him to another country without permission. It was wrong. She was in prison. He didn't know yet that she'd killed his mother. That conversation would come when he was older. For now, Dr. Kimball said it was enough that he knew he was safe, loved, and that I would always protect him. I'd started dating again, something I thought I'd never be able to do. Meeting someone new, trusting someone with my son. It all felt impossibly risky after Diane's betrayal. But Dr. Kimball encouraged me to try, saying I couldn't let Diane's actions prevent me from living fully. I'd met someone, Rebecca, through work. She was a defense attorney, which made for interesting dinner conversations. Oliver liked her. She was patient and funny and didn't try too hard to be his new mom. She understood that spot would always belong to Claire. Rebecca and I had been together for about a year, taking things slowly. I'd told her everything about Diane and the kidnapping. She'd read the trial transcripts, understood the magnitude of what we'd been through. She said she admired how I'd fought for Oliver, how I'd put his well-being first, even when it meant traveling to another country and facing down my own sister. Diane had written me letters from prison over the years. I'd returned most of them unopened, but recently I'd started reading them, trying to understand what had happened to the sister I thought I knew. Diane's letters were filled with apologies and justifications. She was sorry for the pain she'd caused, but still insisted she'd acted out of love. She'd been in therapy in prison and had been diagnosed with several mental health conditions, including obsessive attachment disorder and delusional disorder. Her therapist had helped her see how her inability to conceive had twisted into an obsession with Oliver, how she'd convinced herself that Claire didn't appreciate him enough, that only she could give Oliver the childhood he deserved. Diane wrote that she'd never meant to hurt Claire, that Graham had convinced her the accident would be blamed on weather conditions, that she'd believed they'd get away with it. She wrote that she'd been horrified when Claire died, but also relieved because it meant Oliver would need her. That sentence had made me sick. My sister had been relieved that my wife died because it meant she could swoop in and play mother to my son. The most recent letter from Diane asked if she could see Oliver. Not now, but eventually, when he was old enough to understand and could decide for himself whether he wanted a relationship with her. She wrote that she knew she didn't deserve his forgiveness, but she hoped he'd at least let her explain someday. I hadn't responded to that letter. I didn't know if I ever would. Oliver asked about his mom sometimes, about Claire. I'd kept photos around the house and told him stories about her. He knew she'd died when he was a baby, knew she'd loved him more than anything. He didn't know yet about how she'd died or who was responsible. That truth would come eventually, but for now I let him have uncomplicated love for the mother he'd never really known. Dr. Kimball said this was appropriate, that Oliver would process information about Claire's murder when he was emotionally ready, probably in his teenage years. I'd also kept Claire's journal, planning to give it to Oliver when he was older, so he could read her words and know her thoughts and feelings. The journal would show him that his mother had concerns about Diane, had tried to protect him, had loved him fiercely in the short time they had together. On what would have been Claire's 40th birthday, I took Oliver to her grave. We brought flowers and sat for a while. Oliver said he wished he could have known her. I told him about the day he was born, about how Claire had cried when she first held him, about how she'd sing to him at night. Oliver listened and said he thought his mom sounded nice. I said she was the best person I'd ever known. We sat in comfortable silence, father and son, connected to the woman who'd brought us together, even though she was gone. I'd written this account when Oliver was 10 years old enough that we'd had more detailed conversations about what had happened with Aunt Diane. He knew now that she'd killed Claire, that the car accident hadn't been an accident. He'd cried when I told him, had gone through anger and confusion and grief all over again. Dr. Kimball had helped us process it together. Oliver had asked if he was somehow responsible, if Aunt Diane had killed his mom because of him. I'd assured him absolutely not, that this was entirely on Diane and her inability to control her obsession, that he was an innocent victim in all of this. Oliver had asked if he'd ever see Diane again. I told him that was his choice to make when he was older, that I'd support whatever he decided. Oliver said he didn't think he wanted to see her, that she'd scared him, even though he didn't remember all the details from when he was 3. That was fair. That was healthy. If someday he changed his mind, we'd deal with it then. For now, we were moving forward, building a life that honored Claire's memory while creating new happiness. Diane had tried to destroy us, but she'd failed. Oliver was happy, healthy, loved. I was healing, learning to trust again, finding joy in ordinary moments. We'd survived something horrible and come through it. Not unchanged, never unchanged, but stronger. Our story was one of betrayal and trauma, but also of resilience and love, of a father who'd traveled to another country to get his son back, of a boy who'd known where he belonged even when someone tried to convince him otherwise, of a family torn apart by obsession but reconstructed through determination and hope. This was our story, and we were still writing it, one day at a time. Appreciate you watching this far if you enjoyed it. Drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.